young again. Can you realize what that means? You're a kitten again. Your whole life to live over. How does it feel?
I think perhaps you'll be able to find out for yourself, Miss Starlin. Today will be your first injection. Come.
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about the 1959 film The Wasp Woman, which is directed by the prolific producer and director Roger Corman. This is sadly going to be the last film we are covering from the 1950s, and it has been one hell of a ride. I absolutely love the films from the 50s, and it is the golden era of science fiction for a reason. But before you get too sad about what we're about to jump into, the 1960s does have many things to offer. The next episode will be on the time machine, which I believe is quite a popular one, and I am wearing my time machine t-shirt slightly in advance. Aside from that, we have many great films, including The Day of the Triffids, The Village of the Damned, The Day the Earth Caught Fire, and later on in the decade, we will be touching, obviously, upon 2001: A Space Odyssey, which came out the same year as The Planet of the Apes and Barbarella. And with that consolation, on to my wonderful guests. Roger Luckhurst is a professor at Birkbeck, University of London. He specialises in literature, film, and cultural history from the 19th century to the present. Welcome back to the show, Roger. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm currently in Germany, so hello from Heidelberg.
Lovely. Joining Roger is Cheryl Vint, who is Professor of Science Fiction Media Studies at the University of California, Riverside. She has written/edited many books about science fiction. Welcome back to the show, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, and thanks for having me back.
Thank you so much. I first of all wanted to talk about Roger Corman because we haven't actually covered any of his films. He's knocking about in Hollywood at this time. Roger, can you start off talking about your namesake?
I can, yes. Roger Corman is an absolute legend, really, and I was very disappointed he didn't make it to 100 years old. He died at the age of 98, having made and produced about 500 films in his career. And he's quite often known as the king of the pulp. So he made very, very low budget films, a lot of them every year. He couldn't stand the studio system, so he did try and work inside the system, but just hated it. So much preferred the freedom. And he's famous for producing all of these 50s kind of horror films, drive-in market, teen market, really. And then he accidentally made some really good films in the 1960s, including, he's most famous for his Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. So Fall of the House of Usher, a lot of them with Vincent Price. And then very remarkably, at the same time, he was also a film distributor, and he picked up really, really high art European films. So he was the person who brought, Bergman to America and Antonioni, and he made quite a lot of money out of distributing kind of high art. And then in 1962, he tried to make his own high art film, which was The Intruder with William Shatner, full of, really kind of serious social political commentary, an amazing film about the South and racism, which made absolutely no money. So he never did that again. And then, the other thing he's famous for, I guess, is for being a film school for the new Hollywood generation. So people started with him, really remarkable, all of them.
So would this be in the mid-60s or into the 70s?
Mid-60s later, yeah. So, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, Jonathan Demme, all kind of directed with him first. He brought on people like, minor people like Jack Nicholson, got their first role, Diane Ladd, people like that. So he was legendary for that. And he was only really recognised in the industry in 2009, so right near the end of his life, when he was given an honorary Oscar for all of those terrible hundreds of films that he'd made and produced.
Very interesting. What are your thoughts on him, Cheryl?
Yeah, I think, Roger's covered the major points, but part of my interest, I guess, in Roger Corman films is that he plays with genre. The films, for the most part, are really quite terrible, but something that I do find interesting about him is that he works across all these formulaic genres, and I think that's part of his resistance to the studio system and coming out of a studio system that had a very templatey kind of approach to filmmaking. And many of his films, they seem to me anyways, that they push those templates to their absolute limits. And so some of them fall into the so bad they're good kind of territory, as well as a few of them are actually genuinely good films. And so I feel that he just was very expansive in his interest in cinema and what you could do with cinema. And some of it becomes a little industrial, like 500 films is quite an achievement for anyone, regardless of their quality. But the film school part, I think, and especially the sort of wild, producing a film within like a week or 3 weeks, anything goes kinds of on the fly innovations is really why some of these people coming out of this Corman so-called film school end up doing quite interesting things later in their career, and perhaps relevant for this context, including people like James Cameron famously worked with him, for example. And so he does have an influence on later SF cinema, perhaps stronger than his experiments in other kinds of genres, because he definitely was experimenting in them all.
What I absolutely love about when you read about him is that he decided that he would, after his degree in engineering, he would go off and get a proper job. And he started on Monday, and on Thursday he was like, "I've made a terrible mistake." And I just think that's such a lovely story. He was like, "What am I doing?"
Yeah, fantastically expensive education as well at Stanford University. And then, he lasts 4 days in engineering.
Yeah, well, he did all right in the end, so it's okay.
Well, I mean, an absolute commitment to doing what you want with your life, which is to be admired. And, the late recognition means perhaps for most of his life, people felt he'd made the wrong choice, but his influence really can't be denied.
Absolutely. And Roger Corman does actually have a small cameo in The Wasp Woman, and he plays the Doctor. So that's interesting.
He does, and then all of the people who went for his film school often give him little cameos. So he's in The Godfather, isn't he? I think
Godfather too.
Briefly,
I think he is.
Yeah, and then kind of it pops up in Jonathan Demme films. He's usually playing doctors, actually.
He got typecast. Very interesting. Okay, let's go into 1959 because we have a story here which is about a CEO woman, but that's not very usual for the time.
I think we should be a little conservative, Miss Starlin. Cosmetics are one thing, medications another. We're liable to run into trouble.
Yes. All advertising copy will be cleared through your office.
Well, it's a touchy business,
Max is right, Miss Starlin.
You don't have to second the motion, Nate. I want one thing understood very clearly now, gentlemen. Janice Starlin Enterprises is going to bring the most fantastically saleable product ever developed by modern cosmetics to the public. And I don't intend to be restricted by timidity on the part of my own staff. Is that clear?
Cheryl, can we talk about what kind of roles women have in 1959 when this film is being made?
Sure. I mean, certainly CEO roles were not common for women in life or in film. And this is the sort of era of the voluptuous Hollywood stars, so Marilyn Monroe, people like that. So women's bodies, I mean, this is the era of cinema that are the kind of films that Laura Mulvey is studying when she comes up with the theory of the male gaze as central to how the camera works in cinema. And so women are there to sort of be on display. A lot of femme fatales, because film noir coming out of the 40s into the 50s had been some of the sort of juiciest roles for women. So either they're sort of innocent and virginal, and their wives who may or may not be oppressed by their husbands. I'm thinking of one of my favorite films of the era is Dial M for Murder, for example. Or they're being terrorized in some way, famously by Hitchcock, or else they're somehow sort of scheming, but usually in the family melodrama way. So the idea that they would be scheming in kind of boardroom dynamics, I think, is something quite new. That I don't know if you could date it to this film or not, but it's certainly what intrigues me about the Wasp Woman vis-a-vis the other kind of monster films of the era.
And Roger, you'd mentioned that this is kind of the era that Mad Men was set in, which is completely different when you watch something like that.
Yeah, it is. I just think it brought it to mind because the Wasp Woman features quite a lot of boardroom dynamics and very gendered boardroom dynamics as well. So she's often the central figure is often speaking to a room of grumpy, skeptical men who go, oh well, she's aging a bit, isn't she? She's at least 30. It's all very kind of miserable. And it struck me that, I mean, Mad Men was a series that ran very precisely from 1960 to 1970. And it did feature, it reflected very strongly, I think, on the place of women in both advertising worlds. So you've got Peggy Olson, who's trying to make it as an ad person, ad writer, copywriter. But then you also have, Betty Draper, who's the bored housewife, who's kind of representing that idea of the dissatisfied kind of housewife that Betty Friedan, the early feminist writer, was writing about. There's some kind of malaise that women have in the suburbs, the problem we cannot name. Of course, that's feminism. And there's a kind of sense there that this is reflecting on those kind of gender roles as well. So I was thinking of Mad Men all the time I was watching this.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to quickly mention, before we go into the context of the film, that there were a few real life prototypes for female CEOs, and they did. I mean, of course, there were people like Coco Chanel, but they did tend to be fashion or cosmetic. So Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, Estee Lauder, and Madam C.J. Walker, who was the first self-made millionaire woman, who was also black. So those were
fantastic! I didn't know that. Oh, that's really interesting.
So that's those were very exceptional women during the kind of early 20th century. I just wanted to talk a bit more about the types of films that were inspiring the Wasp Woman. Who wants to talk about The Fly first?
Go for it, Cheryl.
Go for it. I mean, I think it was clear that the success of The Fly was something that Roger Corman was interested in achieving. And it's interesting to me that he switches from a bee woman to a wasp woman, which might have been the more obvious insight to go for, because wasps, of course, are carnivorous and dangerous. And bees, while they can sting you, they also produce honey, which is useful to humans. So there's a kind of like feral domestic kind of dynamic going on there. But otherwise, I think the differences are probably more instructive than the parallels. So it's an experiment and an accident that creates the transformation in The Fly. And he's trying to create this matter, I think it's like a teleporter kind of idea is what he's trying to create. So I guess it's benefiting humankind. But in any case, it's not sort of vanity or something cosmetic like cosmetics, nor is it a money-making enterprise. So there's some kind of aspect of the scientists being, emphasizing the good of humankind compared to the more narrow self-interest that comes up in The Wasp Woman. And then he actually kills himself or sets up his wife to press him in what is surely a later influence on the Terminator, actually, in the way the wasp body is destroyed. And he destroys himself in order to protect his family, right? Whereas the wasp woman has to be destroyed by the good woman in order to sort of protect the possibility of family. So I think those gender politics are quite clear there. And then also, this is not, I think, discussed that much with The Fly, but I also think it's interesting that the wife is almost sort of like incarcerated for making up a crazy story about how her husband turned into a fly. And then she sort of like only by mere sort of sheer circumstance do they find the little like fly with the human head. And then the cops agree to cover up for her. So, there's something interesting in sort of like a repressed reading of the film or something, like why she might want to kill her husband, like connecting to that Betty Friedan framework that Roger introduced to the conversation.
Interesting. What I find funny in both of them is the actual reveal, because with the Wasp Woman, and I think that the poster for the Wasp Woman really misleads you as well, because you're like, okay, so there's a woman, she's going to turn into a wasp, so her waist is going to get really pinched and she's going to start developing like, a segmented body or whatever they are. And it's not. It's just a big wasp face. And I understand on the budget, but it's quite similar to The Fly, which I assume had like a lot of fear back then, like to see a big, or do you think it was also still being played for laughs in the 1950s?
Well, I just think there's definitely a camp element and also a kind of pastiche element that's going on in Roger Corman always. So I think, there are very different rhythms in the film because I think that in The Fly, they know they've got to hold off for the utterly preposterous reveal. And they do so for a really, really long time. Whereas when you're watching Corman, he needs the beats to go faster and more regularly. So you get a full-on Wasp Woman face about an hour in, and then 4 times more, and it's that sort of sense of the release of laughter, actually. And I think he understood the kind of campness of it really strongly. Whereas I think The Fly was intending to be a kind of, serious horror film, whereas I'm not entirely sure Corman ever thought this was kind of serious. He was serious by accident, usually. So I think the rhythm of it is definitely a pastiche of the Fly.
Interesting.
And on the question of effects, I've never actually seen this film. I've only seen stills from it, but there was a 1995 remake of The Wasp Woman.
I watched that, and I would like to report that Roger Corman has made my least favourite film ever. And I respect him so much. But that in itself is, I watched that for this. It is such a bad film. It is such a terrible, terrible bad film. But yes.
Yeah, it didn't really seem worth my effort to try to track it down. But something I do find interesting about it is they're presumably to show off their new kind of effects technology such that it is. We do have the body transform as well as the face. And it transforms like kind of preposterously into this very huge breasted as well as narrow waist kind of body. So you get the sort of 1950s matinee idol huge breasted thing along with the wasp waist.
Yeah, it is very funny though, even though it's terrible. And I think that's the other thing about the 95 remake is there's a lot more sex and nudity in it, which interestingly, despite the setup here where they talk about the Black Widow spider and wasps being kind of very lethal to their partners, we never really go into that.
Yeah, I mean, I often wonder whether, people were reading The Wasp Woman as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, and that in a way, it was obviously punning on that, which is why this is a much better title than the alternatives, which was, I think, The Bee Girl, right? Which was, that's not going to work.
And it also sounds so cute. Cuddly. Yeah, they're kind of fuzzy,
and they're communal, obviously. And I think that the Wasp Woman is not only a wasp because she can get to the CEO level and is this kind of, cut and thrust at the top of the apex predator in New York, but also she is the wasp who is the species mostly is not in nests but are completely lone kind of species and very predatory and parasitic. So that all of that element, as you say, the Black Widow spider is talked about immediately. But it's for teens, it's for drive-in. You're not going to have a full-on sexual representation, I don't think.
And Roger, you have mentioned this, but I want you to talk about it again. You talked about it during Alien, and I, while watching this, I did wonder, especially now that you've mentioned James Cameron, Cheryl, whether there was some influence going on from parasitic wasp creatures. But Darwin's loss of faith. So we've mentioned this in the Alien episode, I must say, but not everyone listens to all the episodes, so go for it.
Yeah, so I just the really nasty thing about this kind of predator figure is that the parasitic wasp, it has a really, really nasty way of reproducing, which is that it basically injects poison into a caterpillar. It injects one of its eggs into the caterpillar, and the caterpillar is then eaten from the inside as this kind of grub grows inside, and it keeps the caterpillar alive long enough so it kind of eats the organs in reverse order of necessity, as one biologist put it. Lovely. So that kind of that image is just really kind of gruesome, and it does come up with Darwin. So Charles Darwin was writing a letter to a fellow biologist who was just kind of saying, well, you've asked me whether I believe in God, and I really don't believe in God. There's too much misery in the world. What kind of God would invent the Ichneumonidae wasp that would eat caterpillars from the inside out? So that's where I kind of lost my faith. And that sense of of that kind of viciousness in nature is surely what the fear is trying to generate in a B movie as well. So I think there is a kind of direct link to that. And Corman was literate enough, I think, to be able to kind of maybe make that link. Definitely think it influences Alien and also Cameron as well.
And in my research of wasps, I did discover that wasn't the only wasp that did that. That's actually very common, that they feed their larvae on this. And one is a tarantula hawk, which
Excellent.
literally does that to tarantulas. Like, it paralyzes them. And again, the larvae have evolved to eat the non-essential parts first, so they stay alive as long as possible. It's horrendous.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they talk about host manipulation as well. So not only is there a kind of an injection of poison, but also a release that kind of changes the behavior of the host so that it actually survives longer for the grub to eat it. So it's like a bit like those zombie ants, the ones that get taken over by
is it
I
mushrooms?
can't remember what the mushroom type thing,
or some type of fungus.
Thing,
sorry,
so that there's a kind of link there. So he's really pressing the buttons of the most gruesome kind of reproductive models in nature, I think.
And to just briefly mention that they did decide on the wasp, but wasps do not make royal jelly, but it's convenient for the film.
No, it is. I think what he's also echoing there is Cleopatra, who is famously kind of linked to using royal jelly for her kind of great beauty, but then also a kind of, a woman out of place, too powerful, should be brought down. So I think there's a link there to, queen bees.
Cheryl, shall we go over to you to talk about queen bees and the fear that they might potentially, or queen wasps, sorry, the fear they might potentially instill?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's much more commonly associated with queen bees, and there's quite a lot of science fiction that has the imagery of like bees, hives. So there's always a fear of kind of communal thinking and hive mind kind of idea comes out in some of that. But also there's a lot of anxiety around the notion that bees might be matriarchal. And so what does it mean to have the social organization rotate around the queen? And sometimes the idea that the male drone bees are somehow like sexually enslaved to her. And you get these very, I wasn't thinking of Cleopatra, but Roger's right that there's a kind of long classical tradition of a kind of like orientalized and feminized East compared to the sort of manly Roman and Greek West, and a kind of sexual excess, lots of ways that women appear in court life more than perhaps they should. So these are kind of long-standing images of fearfulness for Western cultures.
Can we talk a little bit about the office politics, which is where we almost begin? There were 11 or so minutes, 7 to 11 minutes added to the beginning of the film to make it fit for TV. So where we should begin is in this, central New York office, and we're sitting around a boardroom with our Wasp Woman to be leading a meeting. Cheryl, can we talk about office politics during that scene?
Sure. I mean, I think this again explains my perhaps irrational love of this film, because I find it quite interesting that she has her glasses on and she looks very professional. She's not very sexualized in that scene. She's, explaining charts and graphs, and she's really focused on the business side of the operations and does seem quite competent, honestly. She seems like she knows what she's doing, and indeed she's quite capable of running this company. And then the rest of the board is all men. The only other woman in the room is the secretary taking the minutes of the meeting. And they're the ones who actually turn the conversation to this sort of flirtatious suggestion that, the sales fell because she was no longer the cover girl, but they try to turn it not into like, oh, because you're too old to be the cover girl anymore, but because like, your brand is so important to this company.
The public have come to accept you as a symbol. Well, now, after 16 years, they see a different face. They don't trust it. They feel cheated. The simple fact is that Starlin Cosmetics should have Janice Starlin's picture advertising them. Well, that's about all I've got to say.
And a darn good job of saying it, too.
I agree. Lane makes a lot of sense on that score, Miss Starlin.
I think I've had enough flattery for one morning, gentlemen. It was a very convincing argument, Lane.
There's a Mr. Zinthrop to see Miss
There's
Starlin.
only one small factor you've overlooked. Not even Janice Starlin can remain a glamour girl forever.
And she just really doesn't pick up on those flirty signals either. Like, she's very business oriented with all of her male employees. And I find that quite interesting. And then comparatively, her secretary, Mary, is very flirty with the men. And in fact, ultimately starts to conspire with them and steal the letter from her office. And, you know, she's always out having coffee or drinks or talking about having dinner with the men who are conspiring to want to take over the company for themselves.
All right, look, I'll make a deal with you. Dinner is on me if you promise to keep an eye on what goes on in there.
What do you want me to do? Read her mail and send you messages and keep your code?
You could do worse.
Oh, no, Mr. Cooper, not you too.
I've been trying to tell Bright Eyes here that I think Zinthrop is a phony and a confidence man.
So it does seem that the message is how to get ahead in politics is to use your sexuality, because her competence doesn't really matter. The fact that her face aged means that they can't see her as head of the board anymore because somehow her business acumen is conflated with her ability to be in their advertising campaign.
It is interesting. As you say, they don't say, oh, you're getting old. They're like, oh, it's because you're not advertising anymore. And it's interesting because in the 95 version, they are like, you're getting old. You need to find someone to replace you. It's really sad because Mary really does conspire with them. Like, she goes behind her back to get the kind of letters and stuff to pass on.
Always only ever out of concern, though, of
Yes,
course.
it's covered
Just
with
because
concern.
they're worried about her.
Yeah, which I'm sure is a fireable offence, Mary. Yeah. Roger, office politics.
Yeah, I just think the dynamics between the women in the office are really interesting, and I think Cheryl's exactly right that there's a kind of complete kind of desexualization of Janice Starlin in the opening scene, but that is precisely her problem. And I do love that scene later on when she started to secretly inject herself with royal jelly. That she comes in and the other very highly sexualized secretary.
Oh, Mary, how old do I look? Tell me. How old do I look? Tell me. How old?
23, maybe 22?
That's how old I was when I started Janice Starlin Enterprises. Do you realize what that means? I'm back where I started, 18 years ago, with what it took 18 years to accomplish. It's like a dream.
It's entirely actually about the female look, disappointingly at that point, because she seems initially presented as very professional, but that's precisely why she is the Wasp Woman, I guess. That's why the tendencies there of competitiveness and of aggression and of crushing the opposition, all those sorts of things, are going to make her liable to become an addict of royal jelly in secret.
Yeah, it's quite curious, that scene when she comes in and she's asking Maureen how young she looks. So she stops wearing her glasses when she becomes more attractive. So there's a sort of, body versus brain signal
Definitely.
there. But also, I mean, it's curious to me because she's acting sort of girlish and giddy. And so like her entire performance changes, or the actress's entire performance of Janice changes. Which I find interesting too, that it's sort of, you can either be an attractive woman or you can be a woman in business, but you really can't be both at the same time. And when she says exactly like, oh, that's as young as I was when I started. And she says something like, like these looks and sort of the 18 years of I built all this myself. And so and maybe I'm overreaching here, but to me that there's some like aspirational, like she wants to have both. But of course, the logic of the film is revealing is she can't have both, right? That trying to hold on to her youth and also that experience turns her into this monstrous wasp woman. So she should have, I guess, cut her losses and accepted that she had the 18 years, or I'm not sure what else. But I mean, it is interesting to me because it does seem she built that company on her own, and the film doesn't really dwell on that because it's not a film that really dwells on anything like backstory or characterization. But the little hints are there.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because she doesn't seem to have a partner or romantic interest at all in this. So it is that idea that I imagine back in the day that would be considered what a normal woman would do. So, she's already semi-monstrous for being so different, perhaps. And now it just matches that she's got a wasp for a head, or a wasp head for a head.
No, I mean, I think that's quite right, that she like wasted those 18 years, right? When she could have been finding a partner, and Mary's not wasting that time. Yeah. She's making sure she comes out of this with a man, not with a career.
Yeah, and that's what you tend to think about the 50s, isn't it? Is this kind of strong conformity narrative in America. And also this sense post-war, lots of sociologists write about this, of a really strong pressure for women to go back into the home because they'd had these jobs for the war machine during the Second World War. So there's this whole kind of ideology of the domestic space that's being kind of really strongly pressuring women into, suburban kind of living and so on. That's what Mad Men is also interested in exploring, the kind of the sheer kind of constraint that there are about certain roles and the costs that it takes if you go against those roles, which is clearly kind of hovering in the background, I think, of Janice Starlin as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mad Men's an interesting comparison, in part because, as Roger already said, it's set from 1960 to 1970, so it's about characters who were formed during the 50s, the characters that are adults when it starts, coping with the fact that some of these constraints are starting to be challenged in the 60s. And if you look at how angry Betty Draper is as a character, like she's so angry. She's probably the angriest of any of the characters. And from a sort of superficial advertising, how television was cultivating an ideal of the suburbs kind of point of view, she has the best life, right? She's really pretty. She's got this house. She's got exactly the right number of kids and exactly the right gender configuration, really nice clothes. And yet she's just furious all the time. So there's like an aspect of the Wasp Woman sort of in Betty Draper.
And she comes into consciousness through the series, doesn't she? So that kind of anger becomes more explicit. The only other person who's really angry in that is, of course, the daughter, Sally Draper, because in a sense, it's the next generation is going to break out of this and become, much more kind of familiar in the 70s as a kind of feminist figure. So I think there's kind of lots of that sort of element that's emergent in the Wasp Woman, but not on the kind of explicit kind of scripted level. But you can kind of see the kind of figure of the metaphor of the Wasp Woman as kind of, that's all going to emerge quite soon.
And I know we kind of touched upon this, but why do you think they avoided? Is it just timing, budget, and all those kind of things? But it's interesting that Roger Corman didn't do something more exploitative where, I mean, he did in 95, but in the 1959 version where she is like a man-eater, or she is, like, it's hinted at, like the fact that it said, wasps, like black widow spiders, will eat their mates. Why do you think that wasn't touched upon?
Teen market, I would say. So I think, this is a double bill, filmed as a double bill initially. And it's 63 minutes long, and it's for drive-ins, and you need to absolutely make sure you don't get anywhere near kind of thresholds of censorship, I think. So there's lots of kind of suggestion for that. But also I think the tipping into camp makes it safe as well for that kind of market. So I just don't think you can go anywhere near that. When he did get really controversial in The Intruder in 1962, he couldn't get distribution. It was very highly regarded, but was not a big release. So I think he learned that you have to kind of steer within quite conventional, generic devices, and then you don't get into trouble.
I'm definitely going to have to watch that one.
And I mean, I also think this was a film made even for Roger Corman on a very small budget and in a very tight timeline, because I believe it's one of the first, if not the first film made when he was having, not only was he the director, but he also had the production company and he also had the distribution.
That's right.
And so he's pioneering a new way of being in the industry with basically a version of The Fly. And so I think everything was done on the like tiniest of budgets, money wise, time wise, everything.
Yeah, he said he committed to 10 films, didn't he, with the film group. So this is, I think, one of the first of those, and then there's a whole slew of others. But he was always incredibly impressive. He would make, another film inside another film using the same sets and just working at night. Everyone always said that he had absolutely kind of incredible energy while he was doing these things, because he was on such a tight kind of constraint of time.
And that's quite famous about him, I think, throughout his life, that he had really high amounts of energy. I mean, you're going to make over 500 films, I think. that has to remain true. The death of the wasp is quite severe. Cheryl.
Indeed. I mean, as I already was saying earlier, I mean, I think it's striking that it's not a sort of self-sacrifice heroic death, as in The Fly, that when you change the gender, the whole politics around death get changed into sort of punishment. And it's also incredibly striking to me that she's actually killed by being pushed out the window, but she's incapacitated by having acid thrown in her face. And so not only does this mar the beauty she was supposedly going for, although by this point she's the wasp face in any case, but it also echoes real ways that people attack women for non-patriarchal gender-conforming behaviors. And so I think there is something about the kind of violence of the death that ties in with like a very long history of punishments for witch trials, et cetera, where violence is a tool to ensure that women don't get too much power and stay in their patriarchally defined place.
Yeah, like the patriarchy gives women like beauty as their kind of value and worth, and then if you take that away, then it's taking everything away in a way. Roger, I didn't know about the very, very tragic death of the actress Susan Cabot. It's quite horrifying. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, her whole life is just extraordinary, and it's really worth checking out, actually. So this is Susan Cabot, who plays, or Cabot, I'm not sure, Cabot, I think, who plays the central Wasp Woman. And she was, a kind of classic studio starlet, picked up because of her looks when she was very young, I think at the age of 17. And worked in the Universal Studios for a while, but then actually walked out of her contract and went back to New York and to working on the stage. Unbelievably approached by the CIA in order to be a honey trap. This is useful, isn't it? For King Hussein of Jordan, who she did in fact have an affair with for 7 years. And it's not entirely clear if she was being funded by the CIA to do that or not. But she also suffered incredible depression. So when she was going back into films, Roger Corman picked her up, used her for about 4 or 5 films. But actually, The Wasp Woman is her last film. And then she went into, this bizarre kind of life in the 60s, increasingly suffering from mental illness. And then in the 80s, so by the time she was long forgotten, really, in Hollywood terms, she was suffering from severe mental disorder. And she attacked her son in the middle of the night, who promptly bludgeoned her to death with a metal bar. And his defense is almost like a David Lynch story. He said, well, because I suffer from dwarfism, I was taking these particular drugs that cause aggression, a bit like steroids. And that was his defense. And actually, he was let off with manslaughter, accidental kind of death, involuntary manslaughter. So that there was no punishment for that. So that's partly why Susan Cabot ends up in. I was looking at a book called Hollywood's Hard Luck Ladies, and she gets a whole chapter of her own because that's such a grim, desperate story. But it's such a kind of classic Hollywood story of kind of disintegration after this moment of stardom. It feels very Lynchian to me.
I've also read about her that once she sort of left cinema, that she lived as a recluse and then more and more like someone who would be on an episode of Hoarders. And I think that's interesting also, that it's sort of, you're the starlet, you have that like classic discovery story, which is really probably more a myth than not for most people, that you sort of, you're at the lunch counter and then you get launched into stardom. And the version of her public life is very scripted, but in the studio area, as they all were. But once she's no longer beautiful, then she like literally disappears from not only public life, but sort of being outside of her home. And so in a way, the gender politics that this film is embodying also speak to the ways in which she ended up dying.
We will move on to the legacy now, but it's interesting. So another film that was based very much on this is called Rejuvenatrix, also known as The Rejuvenator. And it's not quite as bad as the 95 remake, but it's close. But it's interesting because that theme of chasing youth and beauty, and I had to look up when did Botox come along? So that's 2002. So I can't imagine there were that many films dealing with that. But Cheryl, you said one of the biggest legacy films was potentially one that was huge in the last few years.
Legacy of this, I can't help but think of this in terms of the substance, right? That the connections are clearly there. The idea of punishment is there. The idea of your looks are ultimately more important than your experience or knowledge is there, and the substance then internalizes these things. But I suppose that Janice Starlin did too, right? She's like more. I can't have the dosage the doctor tells me. I must have a higher dosage, and it must happen faster. Things like that. So yeah, to me, the substance, which I know has been very celebrated of late, it's interesting to me that a film from this long ago is essentially embodying exactly the same themes. So that tells us how far we've come, even after sort of two waves of the feminist movement.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, it's interesting how that keeps happening. And what I find interesting in both films is there's a part of me that feels like there's a betrayal of the older woman by the younger woman, because it's kind of letting go of the person that they end up becoming. And it's very obvious in the substance, because she literally will not behave herself, and she keeps acting in terrible ways, which will make the older character of Demi Moore suffer. But I think that's similar in The Wasp Woman, that she's chasing the same thing, the beauty and the youth, at the expense of just having a sane older life and being permitted to grow old. But then society is like that sometimes, I suppose.
But I think what's especially interesting, because there's certainly other melodramas that are about growing old and losing your man to a younger woman and things like that. So what's interesting to me about The Wasp Woman compared to that story is what she wants is her career, right? What she wants is this business she built herself. And yet somehow that has to go via the youthfulness of her face. And so that's where I see the connection to the substance too, because it's this business that she's built, that her sort of business acumen and her knowledge and skills somehow can't be disentangled from her appearance because of the kinds of careers that are open to women succeeding in. So that also goes back to the real life examples that you mentioned at the beginning, that those women who were able to be CEOs, it was always like fashion or cosmetics, right? So that there's these long-standing patriarchal stereotypes about women, or patriarchal confinement of women to certain professions shapes these histories.
Another film that it kind of, there's some echoes of it would be Sunset Boulevard, as she's preparing to get back for her close-up.
She's ready for her close-up.
I love that film. Roger, can we talk a bit more about the legacy of this film?
Yeah, I mean, I think Cheryl's right. So I think it actually kind of folds back into that whole reflection that you get on Hollywood. So quite often, some of the key Hollywood films are about Hollywood itself, like Sunset Boulevard. But also the reflection on this in, say, Mulholland Drive by David Lynch, and that sort of reflection on stardom and what that means, and its kind of twisting plot, which it's the dream of success, it's the ideal in the first half, and then the absolute ruthless undercutting of that. And there is a certain sort of element of, I think this is in the substance as well, of it kind of falling foul of the thing it's critiquing, actually, which is a sort of sense of a fetishization of the female body that is necessary in order to kind of undo the fetishization, but it slightly enjoys the fetishization too much, slightly too many lingering close-ups. And Cronenberg does that as well. I think Cronenberg's very interested in those. I mean, obviously he remade The Fly, but later films on Hollywood itself, Maps of the Stars, things like that. He's very interested in this space as well, and also interrogating notions of female beauty that tip into monstrousness, which is constantly in Cronenberg's films in a very kind of queasy way, actually. Whether you feel it's a critique or it's actually full of misogyny itself, it's a debate worth having about those sorts of films. So I think it comes up everywhere. The other thing that I thought reminded me of was the whole Species series, which is about the kind of, the female, very alluring, attractive female alien who basically devours all of these, male humans that come along as well. So I think, Under the Skin also with Scarlett Johansson, that sort of alien that's devouring men, literally devouring men in that film. So I think there's a lot of elements that come out of Corman, not just the direct influences he has through the film school, but also I think just that sort of body of work that is a kind of B-movie like laboratory that you can kind of mix and put together your own formula from his amazing work.
I'd forgotten about those Species
Oh yeah,
films,
well they're very forgettable, right?
But you're exactly right. Yeah, there's the whole sexual predator 80s vibe that they have.
Yeah. Sadly made in the 90s and around the turn of the millennium. So even later than is quite comfortable. Yeah.
Oh, I just meant her aesthetic is very 1980s. It is really. But yes, the films are later.
Yeah. True. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to quickly mention Maureen, the secretary, who I absolutely adore in this. I love a character who just sits around being, slightly sassy or comedic. She actually went on to play the older version of Gina Davis in A League of Their Own, which was, which I was like, oh yeah, I recognise her. But aside from that, I would like for you to give listeners a recommendation for something they can pair with the film. Roger.
Okay, so I think given that we've been talking about this in the context of women in the 50s and 60s, the thing that came to mind, apart from all of the things we've discussed, would be something like The Stepford Wives, actually, from the mid-70s. So that is a film which is precisely about, kind of what roles are women are allowed to have or not allowed to have in a suburban space, which has this, very strong influence of conforming to certain gender kind of models. It has a lovely, nasty reveal at the end, which probably most people know, but I won't reveal here. But that sort of sense of investigating, exploring what women are allowed to do with their identity as a wife or as someone who has an identity beyond being the wife and mother.
Thank you so much for that. Cheryl.
That's a great suggestion, and it's also reminding me that Stepford Wives starts. The men get quite agitated because the women start having a consciousness raising group, and so that's a problem. So my suggestion is a 1960 film, Les Yeux sans visage, Eyes Without a Face, which perhaps you've covered or plan to cover. Maybe not. It's more horror, really, than science
I'm actually
fiction.
a bit too scared to watch it because I've seen the stills of it, and it just terrifies me.
The stills are amazing.
They're terrifying.
Amazing.
The stills are. It's actually not that frightening a film, but the version. It's about it's about a doctor whose daughter is injured in a car accident, and he's trying to perfect a face transplant so that he can give her a new face. So her life is not ruined by having scars on her face. And the vision of the effects they use to make it look like she has this sort of skin of another face put on her face. They are quite creepy. But among the things I like about that is that it's actually the daughter who resists being the experimental subject. So her father's invested in giving her face back, but she actually doesn't want to be part of this regime. And so without, again, giving away the ending, I would say that it sort of explores the feminist ideas that are implicit in the Wasp Woman much more overtly. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, interesting. I don't normally give recommendations, but I randomly was recommended a song this week, so I'm gonna do that, which is called Royal Jelly by a female band called Deep Valley. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of The Kills, if anyone listens to The Kills. But I just want to point out, they say, if you want to be queen bee, then you better make honey. And that is factually inaccurate because the queen bee does not make honey. But that's my recommendation just because it came into my life. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much for having me again.
Great. That's it for this episode. I want to send out a huge thank you to everyone who is listening and all of the people who've been sending out those lovely reviews. Thank you so much. An extra special huge thank you to everyone who has joined my Patreon, which you can do if you wanted to support the show a bit more, which is at patreon.com/every sci-fi film. Next week, we'll be talking about The Time Machine and finally taking our first step into the 1960s. So if you want to know where to watch that, check out the show notes. And I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.